so welcome back. And I think it's very timely that our first speaker of this next session is Dr. Naomi Horiba, who's a medical officer in GI oncology at the FDA and also the hepatobiliary scientific liaison at the FDA, and deals very directly with all of the clinical trial data and research that we were talking about in the first part of today's talk in the drug approval process. So welcome, Naomi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Katie and Nabil and Stacy certainly for inviting the FDA to be part of this workshop. I think we've been moving closer and closer to involving patients in our drug development focus, and so it is extremely meaningful for us to be a part of this. So, as background, I'm an oncologist who practiced for 6 years in GI malignancy. I was on faculty at the University of Maryland. I've been at the FDA for 3 years now as a medical officer, reviewing clinical trials and applications. I'm also the scientific liaison for hepatobiliary cancers and gastroesophageal cancers. And I initially met Stacy Lindsay at a mini symposium we held at the FDA on the topic of cholangiocarcinoma last year. And I just want to say how impressed we all were with this organization. She really has led an organization that's a model, I think, for other patient advocacy foundations. And I'm sure that she has moved the field forward already by fostering collaboration. And providing a link to patients with cancer, such as some of you in the audience. So I love the mission of the FDA, and I love working at the FDA. But what I think we haven't done very well is to explain what it is that we do and why we do it. So part of my goal today is to kind of give you a little bit of primer on drug development and the drug approval process, as well as some of the expedited programs and expanded access programs that we have to encourage development and have patients and allow patients to access these drugs. And I'm hoping that you guys will feel comfortable asking me questions as well, which I will answer to the best of my abilities. Okay, so not surprisingly, I have no disclosures, and I'm sure you're all aware I can't discuss anything that's investigational or anything for that matter that's not in the public domain. So let's start with some of the basics. There's a long-standing joke at the FDA that we have two types of approval, too fast and too slow. That is actually very illustrative of the push and pull of our mission. We do hope to get drugs out quickly for patients, but on the flip side, we want them to be safe and effective, and we don't want to do this injudiciously. So given a cancer diagnosis, we are aware that the context is important, that safety and efficacy have to be measured in that context. So one is certainly more likely to accept toxicity in a cancer drug given the promise of extended survival or symptom control than in a drug for a patient who is healthy. Now, we also want to know who exactly benefits from a particular drug and avoid putting patients with no reasonable expectation of benefit at risk. So we try to limit the indication of the drug to those who do benefit or who have a reasonable expectation of benefit. And we also want to describe the clinical trial experience. So the label is very important. Probably, you know, as a clinician, I have to say I looked at relatively few labels, but I think that it's a synthesis of everything we have learned through the clinical trial, what we think is important to disseminate to the public. So I think that looking at the label actually can be very instructive for the clinicians. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Oncology Center for Excellence. Some of you may have heard of this. This was created about a year ago, and we just had our one-year anniversary a couple of weeks ago. And the purpose of this is to leverage the combined skills of the regulatory scientists and reviewers with the expertise in the different centers of drugs, biologics, and devices, including the diagnostic devices. Now, there are multiple centers within the FDA, and traditionally we had been somewhat siloed, so that the drug approval center, which is called CDER, there are a lot of acronyms at the FDA. So CDER and OHOP, which is where I live, we weren't talking so well with the biologics folks. Those would be the people who approve things like the TILs, and some of the immunologics, although typically the drug folks have dealt with the immunologics more than the biologics center. And we haven't also been, there's been traditionally a little bit of siloing and also as well with the diagnostics and the devices folks. So the goal of the Oncology Center of Excellence was to bring all of these centers together. And Rick Pazder, who's the director of the OHOP within CDER, was named director last year. His wife died of ovarian cancer about a year and a half ago. And so, I'm just trying to give you a sense that we're certainly not tone deaf. We've all been affected by cancer one way, either as practitioners or as patients or families of patients. So this is an organizational chart because no FDA talk would be complete without an organizational chart. This is where Scott Gottlieb lives. And down here, here's I'm having a hard time saying, I can't imagine what you guys are looking at. So this is the Oncology Center for Excellence, and these are the three centers that I just told you about: the biologics, the drugs, and the devices. So I just want to spend some time talking a little bit about the drug development process. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but and probably have been involved on a personal level. But I just want to point out the different stages of a clinical drug development, because I think it's important to know where the FDA interacts and intersects with the sponsors. So most chemical entities and antibodies will never come to us. But once a pharmaceutical sponsor has identified a promising agent and performed preclinical and toxicology studies in animals, they'll approach us about testing in humans. Every agent tested on humans in the United States must be under an investigational new drug application, or an IND. Some of these are exempted, just full disclosure. Some of these are exempted because they are commercially available drugs, but any phase 1 trial, any investigational drug use in a human being is covered, and the FDA does see it. So typically, a drug will start development in a first-in-human trial. And the typical model for standard cytotoxic chemotherapy, like cisplatin or gemcitabine, is to push the dose until toxicity requires stopping the escalation. With some of the more recent targeted agents, a dose may be chosen for biological effectiveness, such as receptor saturation. And that suggests that a further increase in dose would not be more beneficial. And usually this is the dose that's chosen to move on to the phase 2 study. So cohort expansion is where a sponsor targets a specific indication, such as cholangiocarcinoma. So in other words, selecting out the patient population that will benefit. Some agents are more specific, as you've already heard. They will be restricted to certain populations, such as the FGFR abnormality-bearing tumors. So there are some randomized phase 2 studies, but typically the randomized clinical trial, or the phase 3, is a large registrational study designed to be the primary evidence to support marketing. So one of the aspects of the randomized clinical trials is that statistics plays very heavily in the design of these trials, and it's a little bit esoteric, so I'm not going to go into it. But the pre-specification of like having a statistical plan, knowing what it is at the outset before you start the trial, is very important, and actually is essential to proving what the benefit is of a drug. So we will meet with sponsors at the end of the phase 1 trial typically, and at the end of the phase 2 trial, and that's what we want, because we want to make sure that a sponsor isn't undertaking a large clinical study that isn't going to end up showing what they intended to show, especially with all the lives and the time and effort that go into these trials. So the investigational new drug team consists largely of these specialties. The clinical reviewer, that would be me, the chemistry and manufacturing reviewer, who looks at the chemical itself, the pharmacology, toxicology reviewer who looks at the preclinical and the toxicology studies, or basically the animal studies. We have a clinical pharmacologist. Sometimes we'll have biostatisticians, depending on the complexity of the trial. Of course, we have a project manager who keeps this organized, and oftentimes we'll end up consulting the devices in the diagnostics group, especially when tests are being used to select a population that will benefit. So let's move on to the circumstance in which the application is being submitted for marketing approval. There are two types of approval, and it's not too fast and too slow. It's regular and accelerated, actually. So these are the primary means by which a drug will make it to market. Regular approval means that there is demonstration on a direct clinical improvement on a direct clinical benefit, such as physical functioning, tumor-related symptoms, or overall survival. And of course, I think in oncology, the vast majority of regular approvals have had their basis on the overall survival endpoint. But that being said, there is evidence. We do have a drug, Jakafi, which was approved in myelofibrosis based on a tumor symptom score, in which patients with splenic enlargement, which is the hallmark of that disease, demonstrated improvement in this tumor symptom score, such that this became the primary basis for approval. And I should say as well that right now we have a lot of efforts looking at patient-reported outcomes. This doesn't just encompass quality of life measures, which are important, but they look specifically at symptom-specific measures. So we look at toxicity with a common terminology for adverse events as a way to standardize the toxicity across patients. But this is a judgment that's rendered by the provider, not the patient. So in order to better capture the patient experience, National Cancer Institute developed a patient-related outcome tool. It's called CTCAE-PRO, with contribution from many, including some of my colleagues. And I think there'll be a talk from Corey. Jane Perlmutter will be speaking after me about that. But just suffice it to say that that is certainly one of the office's efforts. Okay, so I spoke about regular approval, and now I'd like to talk about accelerated approval, which is this third column here. These are expedited programs, and accelerated approval is the only approval pathway. I'll talk about the other ones briefly following that, but the accelerated approval pathway it requires confirmation by showing a demonstration of direct clinical benefit, but the primary means by which a drug can be approved under the accelerated approval pathway is by demonstrating a benefit on a surrogate endpoint. So a surrogate endpoint might be something like response rate, tumor shrinks, excuse me, or progression-free survival, because we know that there can be complicated issues with showing a benefit in terms of overall survival. Plus, this also allows drugs to reach the market faster than they would otherwise if we had to wait for survival data. Let's see what else. Okay, so there is a requirement that drugs that are approved for through the accelerated approval pathway have to demonstrate benefit. Supportive data that has to be provided following that. So that's a requirement. And to date, there's only been one drug that's been removed for approval for its indication based on lack of ability to demonstrate survival benefits. So suffice it to say that this is extremely rare, and most drugs that achieve or that win accelerated approval are on the market. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about expanded access. So the question is, what do you do if you don't have access to a marketed drug? The most common means by which to access these drugs is through single patient INDs. And I think we heard one of the audience members make reference to a physician who was trying to get approval for drugs, and it was probably through a single patient IND program. And this is an application to the FDA for single patient, and this is initiated by their provider, who would administer the agent. And the key here is that the sponsor has to agree to provide the agent. And the sponsor has no obligation to do that. And I think that's been one of the barriers to accessing some of the investigational drugs that we've seen. So what I think that the expanded access does offer, though, is it offers FDA oversight in terms of making sure the trial's being done ethically, there's an IRB looking at it, and that there's an informed consent document, that the patient has actually had adequate disclosure of the risks of that drug explained to them. And then also that the investigator themselves has access to management guidelines and be aware of drug-drug interactions and so forth. So I do think that there is a lot of value in having the FDA have a role here. And by the way, we've approved 99% of the single patient INDs that come across our door. And I can't give you a time frame on that, but I know that personally when I get one, I usually do it within a couple of hours. So getting delay at the FDA, although I know that's sort of the myth or the rumor, that's not typically, or that's not at all what the oncology office, we're aware of the compulsion, the need to get these drugs out fast. Okay. And one last word about our office's efforts to have patient voices heard. Our Oncology Center of Excellence does have a patient-focused drug development program. It fosters collaboration between the FDA and external stakeholders, those who are involved in patient outcomes research in the cancer population. So the goal is to identify methods to be able to adequately assess that. And so we're so pleased to see efforts like Stacy's with the patient registry because we think that can provide meaningful data to support this end. And so the program focuses on several key areas. We are looking to actively engage patients and advocacy groups such as this one. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to do that. We're also interested in fostering research into the measurement of the patient experience and generating science-based recommendations for regular policy. Because the information that we glean from this data, even if it doesn't go to the primary approval of a drug, it does play into our minds, and we do take this into account. We do take this into account moving forward. So that's all I have. But if any of you have questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
One quick question on the individual patient requests. Does the FDA require the manufacturer to collect data about that patient? And if they do, is the manufacturer required to include that data in its submission to the FDA?
The answer to that is actually no. We don't require them to collect that data, but we do, there is a burden of safety reporting. Now, it really comes down to the relationship between the clinician and the sponsor. So the clinician's also under no obligation to provide feedback to the sponsor, but I think typically that does happen. But certainly we're aware that, with patients who don't have a multitude of other options, that there are likely toxicities. And if this is, if there's a single toxicity that's seen in under a single patient IND, that rises to the level of safety reporting, I mean, it's very hard to ignore that, but it's also very rare for that to be a barrier to approving a drug or to getting the drug on the market. And actually, John Jarrow in our office has looked at that, and there has not been, it has only one time led to the addition of a toxicity on the label. That's been the worst of it. Yeah.
So it may or may not be worth talking about, but since our president talked about it last night, you might want to talk about right to try and how that fits in, and how these compassionate uses differ from patient assistance for approved drugs. I think some people might be interested in some of that.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, actually. So the truth, so I'm not speaking for my agency here, but I have to say, for the right to try laws, in the absence of understanding the process, I think it is very attractive. It sounds very attractive, but I'm still somewhat puzzled as to how this is going to ultimately benefit patients, because sponsors are still, so if the concern is we're not getting access to the drugs that we want to get access to, the sponsors are still, they still have the right to refuse to provide a drug, and that does happen. I can't cite you a statistic on that, but it does happen. What would be lost with a right to try law versus a single patient IND would be that FDA oversight, making sure trials done ethically, making sure there's an informed consent, that the patients have received some adequate disclosure as to the risks of what they're getting into, as well as maybe, there's insight about the toxicities and about the drug interactions wouldn't be available to the provider. And I just know, as a provider, I certainly would want that information. And I think my patients should expect that information. That was your question, too. Okay. All right. Oh.
Question.
I'm sorry, can I ask one question as well?
Go ahead.
Quickly. So I know, like, for a lot of the modern day clinical trials, if there's like a standard of care that's available, that there actually will be no placebo group, that the placebo group would just be the standard of care that's available. I was wondering, like, just from an FDA perspective, what is being done when you get a new protocol that you're reviewing? Is there like an effort to adjust that to make it more ethical and increase the number of patients that are actually getting treatment versus placebo?
So you're talking about like a randomization scheme in which there'll be a 2-to-1 randomization or something like as what Katie was talking about earlier, yeah. The question isn't so much about, concentrating or increasing the number of patients who will actually be getting drug. I think that is more of an operational issue in terms of, if I'm a patient, I'm going to rather be on a trial that has a higher chance of randomizing me to something that's going to work. But it's also a question of equipoise, and do we, is it reasonable to think that this drug is there other data to support that this is a great drug? And, there's promising data out there that already exists in the clinical arena, then it's not equipoise, and placebo would not be appropriate. So some placebo trials go forward, some don't, just depending on the disease, on the agents that are being studied. And so no, it's not that we realize that placebo it's a very unattractive sounding option, but sometimes it may not be worse than receiving an investigational agent.
One more quick one. The clinical trials, who's responsible for making sure that the results are published? If we go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look, there are 90% of the trials are completed with no results.
No results, that's
and
right.
Isn't it the law that the results have to be posted and apparently?
No, it's not the law.
It's not?
It's not the law.
Okay.
So on clinicaltrials.gov, I can't swear to this, but I believe that trials that are posted to clinicaltrials.gov, there is some declaration of your intention to, or your commitment to provide your results regardless of if they're positive or negative, but I don't think there's any time frame stated. So I have a feeling that if it's not a positive trial, then it's very, very unexciting. And I think that's sort of been one of my personal concerns, because I think there is valuable data there that can be shared in the scientific community to provide guidance in terms of what next steps can be.
So there's no requirement, there's
No,
nowhere else we can go to
Not
look?
to my knowledge. Like I said, maybe just, social pressure, but no legal, nothing legal.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is it 1 year? It's a 1 year, yeah, but it's a suggestion. And I can't tell you how many sponsors are actually compliant with that.
One quick question on that, and then one other quick question.
Sure.
Do your oncologists have access to know how a trial is going, if it's promising?
Actually, sometimes the sponsor doesn't have continuous access to data, meaning to so I alluded to this earlier. So there's statistical, so you can't look at the data. You can't look at the data every time a patient enrolls to a trial, because if you do, I don't know, for lack of a better term, it corrupts the data and may render the analysis uninterpretable just by looking at the data. So the statistical plans will actually pre-specify when you can look at the data. So sometimes not even the sponsors are aware of their results on an interim basis. So the investigators aren't either,
Okay.
typically.
And the other question is on compassionate use. If I hear that there's a cholangio person that, wherever they've gone, it hasn't been beneficial, and I'm in a trial where they're doing this trial for all solid tumor types, and it's extremely successful so far with this small group in stabilizing or better. And I keep thinking, oh, if that person could just, but it's only at one cancer center because they had to, I guess, buy a very expensive, huge machine for just the test in the beginning to check on protein something. So if somebody had a compassionate use, would they still have to move to that state, or could they get it somehow through a nearby cancer center that would do the blood tests and the EKGs and things,
Right.
and they could get that medicine.
Right. I understand what you're saying because I think the access to clinical trials is often geographically limited when it's only being performed in a single center, maybe a few centers. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen, meaning that if it is a single center trial, then you do have to go to that center. Now, the only option would be, or the only option would be to get the trial open somewhere closer to home. Unfortunately, I think there are probably other reasons, but from a regulatory perspective, it makes it difficult for us to go back and look. We don't, we have to know who the investigator was, what their familiarity with clinical trials. Running a clinical trial is a huge cost. It's a time investment. And following a protocol is not a piece of cake. It is extreme. If there's toxicity, if something happens, then they have to be able to follow the protocol pretty much to the letter to ensure that patient's not being cared for in a way that's unsafe for them.
So you couldn't, say, for example, trust a local, well-respected cancer center that's not huge
Right.
to be able
Well-
to administer it, even though they're used to doing trials and sticking to protocols?
Well, in that case, if they're familiar with doing trials, I don't see why that trial couldn't be opened at that center. But no, that doesn't. If they're not willing to open the trial for whatever reason, then you have to. It's really up to the sponsor actually, and what their comfort level is. But I don't think there's any FDA requirement, except that they have to register, a sponsor has to let us know who is going to be investigating, who's going to be administering their drugs and running the clinical trial for that patient.
Okay, thank you.